Welcome, brothers. Welcome, Michael, who is also a brother. I am delighted, as I think you may be, that Tom Kunkel is here. He was here once years ago. I think you know a good deal about him. He is the president emeritus of St. Norbert College. He had that position for 9 years. 9 years. And before that, he was the dean of the School of Journalism at the University of Maryland. Before that, he was in the news business. He is from Boonville, Indiana, all the way down there in the south near, those of you who know St. Meinrad Abbey, know that if you know that area, then you know where he's from. Man on Fire was his 7th book. He just said something which, especially to Maurice, will be of great importance. You have to tell me exactly what the title is, but you have some important role with the Green Bay Packers.
I did. I used to be important in a lot of ways. Now I'm completely insignificant. I was on the board of directors of the Packers for 11 years.
Oh, no more?
No, well, they asked me to stay on, which was very nice, but Boonville, Indiana is roughly 535 miles from Green Bay, and wisely, the team, as with many organizations, a lot of the business gets done in committee meetings. They actually prefer you to come to committee meetings. And the other issue was, with the Packer board, I think it's like, there's like 43, it's a community board, so there are like 43 members, of which I think only 15 are allowed to be from outside Brown County, which is where Green Bay is, because it's really intended to be a local board. And I knew that if I wasn't going to be able to really participate like I would have liked, they needed that slot,
right?
That outside slot for somebody who could. So it was it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right, so the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it. It's so nice to be here with you on Founders Day. It seems like Abbot Richard it seems like an eternity ago, given what's gone on in the world since, but it was in the spring of last year when Abbot Richard, one of my many former bosses in this world, Richard was on the college's board of trustees, invited me to come for this Founders event. Abbot Dominic has followed up and reiterated the invitation, and I'm sad that I gather this would have a lot of your associates and friends of the family and that sort of a thing, and hopefully some of them are going to be joining us virtually. But it's an honor for me to be here. As Andrew mentioned, I had the opportunity to come to Dalesford once before, probably 9 or 10 years ago. Several of us from the college took the opportunity to not only visit here at the Abbey, but then to see our friends at Archmere, and Michael Marinelli is here. That was the first time I had the opportunity to work with Michael, and our institutions have done quite a bit of work together, so really enjoyed it. Was struck at the time by what a beautiful Abbey you have here, and it felt, you could feel the sense of community in the place, not just detect it in the interactions of the people, but you could sense that this was a place that was your home. And you could also definitely feel that Norbertine quality that maybe is a little hard to define, but to paraphrase one of the justices, you sort of know it when you see it, or you certainly know it when you feel it. And so delighted to be back, and I hope I get the chance to come back soon, when we're all kind of back to normal, as we keep saying and trusting that we'll be back to normal one of these days. My wife Deb sends her regard to those of you who know Deb. She's on grandmother duty at the moment, or she would have come up, but she'll come back with me. So I'm thrilled. The only aspect of bad planning, other than COVID, was I think the Eagles and the Packers are both playing as we speak. So I'll have to catch up, either have to catch up with them later, or somebody will have to catch up with me later. So thank you again for the invitation and for your hospitality, and what's been a really enjoyable day so far.
Good.
So let's go.
You're not going to speak first?
Well, you go ahead. Let's go.
All right. So, the question to start at the end would be to say, what got you to do this? To write Mail and File.
I should also say that most of you know this, but Andrew and I go back quite a ways because, in addition to being your confrere, he's been a presence, almost a fixture at St. Norbert College, his alma mater, for some time now. So that's where he and I first got to know each other, and then really had the great pleasure of working very closely with Andrew, more closely when he was running the Center for Norbertine Studies, which is this beautiful facility inside a beautiful facility, which is our library. And under his tutelage and under his guidance, not only built up the collection and the acquisitions remarkably, but just created these really important connections around the world and helped really reinforce at the college the sense that we are part of this global community. And I just have really appreciated that. So we became good friends, and I started talking to Andrew, I know, years ago about the idea of the book. How it came to be is actually kind of simple. Many of you are aware, and a few of you I think have been along, that for the better part of a quarter century, I guess now, the college has been doing, we call them Norbertine Heritage Tours. And they were started the college was looking for ways to reinforce the sense of Norbertineness and to make, to really strengthen the bonds, with other Norbertine institutions. And the notion was that we'll take a couple dozen people every spring as soon as school's out. So it's trustees, it's administrators, it's faculty, it's some donors, it's friends of the court, go to and spend a couple weeks basically visiting various Norbertine sites in Europe. And even by the time I got there in 2008, I already knew from a lot of testimony that this had gone a long way toward really connecting people at the college to the broader Norbertine community, to the order in particular, and to help explain what this whole Norbertine phenomenon was. So I came in the summer of 2008, so I went on my first Norbertine Heritage Tour in the summer, late spring, early summer of '09. And what they do at St. Norbert, when they do this, everybody who's going is sort of this class, actually, and you read a book about Norbert, and then you meet several times, and then you go on the trip. And the book that we got was, I think it was a Vandenherk book, at least at the time.
Yes.
Yeah, when I was. And who was a Dutch Norbertine, I guess. Mm-hmm. And so he had written it, and it had been translated into English, and it was fine for what it was, but it wasn't, I hope, God bless him, he won't mind. It wasn't really gripping reading, and nonetheless. But then so we're on this trip, and we're 2 or 3 days into this trip, and I'm going, well, this is remarkable. Just visiting a few sites and talking to some of the European Norbertines, and being inspired, but also, learning more along the way. I thought, well, this is A, remarkable, but B, we really need a book that gives people a better idea of who this fellow was and why this is all here. And I still have it. I didn't bring it, but I still have it in my Norbert file at home. I sat on the back of the bus on like day 3, and I said, somebody needs to write, I said a monograph, because even though I'd been in academia long enough to know that, what a monograph was. I was 15, 20,000 words about this life. And I wrote an outline, literally, sketched out what it could say. And, years go by. We went again a few years later. And anyway, the upshot was, when I was going to retire, leave St. Norbert in the summer of 2017. We went the year before, with a year to go. Debbie and I went on our third Norbertine trip, and this time, knowing I was going to be on my way out, I committed to the school that I would, because nobody else had stepped up to write this monograph or this book I had in mind, and I thought, well, this really is something I think I would enjoy, and also this is something I could do when I leave. It would be a nice way to stay connected to the college, but without getting in the way of Brian Brees, my successor. The last thing, it doesn't matter what kind of, we have a great relationship, Brian and I, Andrew and I were just talking about that, but the last thing a college president wants to see is his predecessor, hanging around. And so I'm 500 miles away in Boonville, Indiana, but it was going to give me something constructive to do in my first year away. And I knew that it would be something that the institution could use. I sort of approached it as like a first year book, possibly for students, but also a book for new faculty, new trustees, anybody who might be interested in Norbert and knew of him but didn't really know about him. And that was my goal. So I wanted to write this accessible book about him, and that's what I set out to do.
Maybe speak a little about the journey you and Deb did right after you stepped down to sort of, you had made some contacts and then you went back and renewed those?
We did. So when I, having made this commitment, I also wanted to go back and touch some bases. For instance, in those 3 trips, it just so happened that we never had gone to Xanten. And I knew I wanted to see Xanten. We'd been to Premontre a few times, but I wanted to go back to Premontre. I knew that there were some individuals that I wanted to talk to, like Father Dominique Marie Dosé at Monday, who's writing the history of the order from a French perspective. I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to talk to Herman Janssens. I wanted to talk to now Abbot General Joost Waters, and some other folks. So we decided to go back and kind of did our own Norbertine trip for 2 weeks. We were fortunate. We nearly divorced before we got out of the Paris airport, because this was the first time I've ever been in Europe where I was doing my own driving and she was doing the navigating. That nearly put us under what had been a 40-year marriage at that point. And but that was a blast. And we, but this time I was there to, knowing I was going to write, so I was trying to, I was taking more notes and being more observant about impressions of things. The other thing I should mention, and I think it's still out there to be seen if people are interested, but you and I did the MOOC.
The MOOCs.
Massive Open, MOOC, MOOC stands for Massive Online Open Course. It's when learning started going online in higher education. So tens of thousands of people can take a class if they want to. And Andrew and I, again, he's been such a godsend, on this project and such an inspiration. But knowing I was going to do this, Andrew and I decided to do a MOOC at St. Norbert about Norbert the man and the history of him and the history of the order, which we did for, gosh, was that 6 or 7?
7 Tuesday nights.
Yeah, which was a lot of fun, and people seemed to enjoy it. But that was immensely helpful. And then Andrew has been sort of the godfather of this whole project. And the other thing I should have said at the beginning, I neglected to, but I don't want to overlook, is Father Chad. This book doesn't happen without him, and I really want to personally thank him again with all of you here. I don't have to tell you what the authority he is on Norbert. And a funny anecdote, in my last year when we made it more public that this was that I was going to pursue this, and of course Ted was aware of it, but all of a sudden one day I get an email from Father Ted, who I got to know because he was the Norbertine guide and grown up in the room on the last Norbertine Heritage trip that we went on. He filled in for you because you went and got your wrist operated on, or shoulder. So, but anyway, I get an email one day from Father Ted, and he said, I'm very excited about this, and I thought you might be interested. Here's some material that maybe could be of use to you. And there were 35 attachments, and they were all articles, about the subject. And then about an hour later, I got another email from Ted, and he said, "Oh, here's some more that I think you might find useful." And there were 25 attachments, with that. So that gives you some idea not only of the breadth of his scholarship, but also how magnanimous he was to Greenhorn, on this project. And of course, it literally couldn't have been done without you. So thank you again for that, Father Chad. So.
Right. So, what's next?
Well, I have to say, I've been delighted that so far, I think, I know that people who read the book seem to have enjoyed it. And I also know that at St. Norbert, it is being used as I had hoped. There are a lot of classes that are talking about the Norbertine tradition and the life of Norbert that are utilizing it. In fact, and some non-traditional classes that are doing that. In fact, I was on a Zoom call just last week with Joel Mann, who runs the honors program at St. Norbert College, and he's got a class with a number of kids that are studying Norbert as the focal point of their honors class this year. So that was.
And they hope to.
They're going, yeah.
To go to Europe this summer.
That's right.
Yeah, to Prague and. Yeah.
That's their plan.
Right.
So, so I should say, what I wanted to do, and maybe I'll just say a little bit more, and we can kick this around a little bit, Andrew, was, not only, so one goal I had, I mentioned earlier, and that was I really wanted to write a book to just say who this fellow was and how this whole Norbertine phenomenon came to be, and to some extent how it survived for as long as it has. But the other question, just as a writer, was we were kind of talking before the program started, just what made him, who was this guy? I've written several biographies, and that's always the driving question. Who is this person, and why did they do? And when they got to this point, why did they go left instead of right? And Norbert is just one of these people that, even though he's a millennium old, he just really struck me as a very, very modern sensibility. And I had to take some care with that, because especially when I was talking to some of our colleagues in Europe, including Abbot General Yost. He wasn't Abbot General then, but soon to be. They just cautioned. They said, you've got to make sure that when you're talking about lessons to be learned from Norbert and his life or that sort of thing, which there certainly are many, but he said you've got to take care to make sure that you don't forget that he was of a certain time and he was a man of his time, and that not to make the mistake some historical biographers do, which is to propel their person into present day and maybe draw conclusions that aren't warranted or aren't fair. And I thought that was really good advice, something I tried to. But having said that, the more I learned and the more I saw and the deeper I got into his life, I have to say that the more I felt like I really feel like this is somebody that has what to me was a contemporary sense of way of looking at the world. Yeah. And the religion, the spiritual aspect of it almost aside, if you look at him, think about that life. Today we would call him an entrepreneur. We would certainly call him a leader. To some extent he was a manager, although he was a good enough leader to know that he wasn't as good a manager as he was a leader, but I better find a pretty darn good manager, so he found Hugh. What he was a communicator, of course, of the highest order. That's what he did, and what do we value more than anything today? Almost, his communication skills. He was a risk taker. He was not afraid to speak truth to power. And it seemed to me like he was always looking for the next thing. Not necessarily like he was running from something, although maybe once in a while maybe he was, but it felt to me like the kind of person that knew he was meant to lead a big life, I think. Even if he didn't necessarily know what that was going to mean. I think that was the reason that all those years when he was ostensibly being teed up to be a priest, he wouldn't do it. And I think part of that was just because whatever it was, maybe it was God telling him that this is not your time, but I think he knew, the big game is still out there, and he was kind of waiting for it to present himself. But to me, that feels very modern, considering that at that time, the oldest son's going to get the property and the title and everything and the power, and and the youngest son, the younger brother, went off to fight in the Crusades, but the second brother was going to be the priest. I mean, everybody kind of knew their roles at this point in the Middle Ages, and he wasn't remotely interested, I think, in settling into any particular role. So who was he? Why was he like that? And what made him tick? And how did that manifest itself into the person that became the Norbert that we think we know? So that was my goal, because I certainly didn't have the spiritual or theological background to try to explicate, the theological importance necessarily of his order. But I do know something as a longtime journalist and as a writer of books. I do know something about trying to figure out what makes people tick, and that's what I was mostly trying to do.
I think that we say in scripture scholarship that in some ways we understand and know St. Paul better than the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I think that we know and understand more about Norbert than at any point in history since he died. And that we really, in terms of what we receive in the division, there really is, in the best sense of the word, a revisionist history. So, Norbert's conversion is not, as far as I can see, a conversion from a life of debauchery. It's the term that I use is not being ordained, that he was an opportunistic cleric. He was using his position to be in a position at the court of the emperor and the archbishop. But some of you know, has Carol Neal ever been here? Carol Neal, has she? Yeah. So Carol Neal is the authority on St. Norbert writing in English. She's at Colorado College. She did the book with Ted Antry. And because I'm preparing to teach the History of the Order course in Albuquerque in January, I've been going through some of my files, and I found things that I had forgotten were there. And she has an article on the word ordo in the 12th century, at the time of Norbert, that it's a word that has two meanings. It means a way of life, so that when Norbert was getting approval from the Pope for his ordo, he was getting approval for the way of life at Prémontré. He was not getting approval for an order, which is what developed under Hugh Foss. But she makes clear in the course of that, basically Norbert went underground from when he died. That was part of the fact that somebody like Godfrey of Cappenberg was so disillusioned that Norbert, took this position in the hierarchy that he basically left Magdeburg where he was and was headed back to Cappenberg and died on the way at a young age. And that the Magdeburg group and the Prémontré group really were at one another almost from the beginning as to where the real head of the order as a institution should be. But that what we learned about Norbert basically is a result of the Counter-Reformation, especially the piece about Norbert being the apostle of the Eucharist. Now, that may come as a shocking statement, but in other words, that Norbert was utilized for the order to be an element against the attacks on the Eucharist in the Reformation. I mean, Norbert celebrated the Eucharist sometimes more than once a day. He preached against Eucharistic heresy in Antwerp. We all know that he never saw a monstrance, right? But it was as a preacher and a reconciler. And the other is that we got very, very little about Norbert after he went to Magdeburg. And the enormous piece of information we have about that now is because of this dissertation that this priest from Postel, Wilfried Grauen, wrote. And what we see there is that, the way that we learned it was that Norbert was the defender of the papacy. Well, he was. He was going with the emperor to establish the rightly elected pope against the anti-pope. But on that whole trip, as the chancellor of the empire, he is doing this constant work of negotiation between the emperor and the German bishops about the whole question of the appointment of bishops. So we're learning a lot that we never knew. And, I don't think we ever asked the question, what was this guy's personality like? But in these series of articles that have been commissioned by all of the American houses for the 900th, a recent one was the writer, this professional writer, wrote, "What was Norbert like?" And some of the answers are very interesting because, Chrysostom Bear, the prior of Orange, she says, "He was both encouraging and daunting, extremely charming and friendly, yet his otherworldliness would have been a challenge. He was both a good conversationalist and quiet. Yes, he had a sense of humor." Well, I mean, I don't think as a novice I was taught that kind of person. Joel Garner writes, charismatic, physically vigorous, strong-willed. He was a strong leader, perhaps a little overpowering at times. I think that's pretty accurate.
More than a little.
Yeah. Brad Vandenbergen said, "I get a sense that he was a very zealous person. That was both good and bad. That made people uncomfortable. He called them out in public for their faults. He had this mission to accomplish." So this thing of this level of energy, and I think you're absolutely right. Norbert never settled long in one place. That it's why he doesn't found Prémontré as an abbey, a place of, we're all going to take the vow of stability here. Eventually, it becomes that. I think you've probably heard this before, that in a certain sense, Hugh of Foss is more the founder of the order than Norbert was. But so as he was utilized in the Counter-Reformation, not falsely, but emphasizing one particular piece, I would say I think that's why I think in so much of the writing today we come at him as a reconciler, apostle, not only apostle of the Eucharist, but apostle of peace and concord.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
should we open it up to
yeah,
see what's on the
yeah.
runs?
Richard.
I'm interested in your own personal feelings about Norbert. And obviously, you, as a biographer, you listed some criteria that you use, in describing the world of the man. What were 2 or 3 things that you discovered on a personal level that were really striking to you about Norbert?
Well, as I got into it, I mean, I knew the general outlines of his life and even some of the particulars of his life, but in pursuing the book, it was only, for instance, that was only then when I really began to appreciate the extraordinary last chapter of his life, the time after he became the Archbishop of Magdeburg, but in his role as the counselor to Emperor Lothair, and the extraordinary sort of the shuttle diplomacy. That's what I call it. He was he was effectively the Henry Kissinger of his day, shuttling back and forth between the emperor and the pope, between the pope and the anti-pope, and triangulating all that, and working with counterparts like Bernard to sort of politically figure out who was going to win, Innocent or Anacletus. I was blown away by the fact that he was operating at the highest precincts of power in the world at that time, if you really think about it. And in a sense, in an almost impossible job, but in another sense, having this unique. There's someone, I can't remember who I quoted, but they said when he was speaking to the Pope, he was representing the Emperor, and when he was speaking to the Emperor, he was representing the Pope. Just this extraordinary liaison that he had, and I thought in a way, almost everything in his life was leading up to this critical moment about that. In some ways, was an inflection point about the future of the Church, and in a sense, to some extent, the future of Western, politics. And here's our guy that we think about in terms of the order at Prémontré and a peacemaker and that sort of thing, but just effectively doing the highest level realpolitik that you could possibly do, and being impeccably prepared for it, given everything that had transpired. I was really knocked out, by that. On the other end, the beginning of his career, kind of allude back to what I was talking about a while ago. I was really struck. We tend to think about saints, and all saints have interesting lives, and they have their lives developed to the point where they make choices that we remember them for. But it's interesting. It was interesting to see this life developing before he really knew what he wanted to do, and interesting to see the choices that he made that maybe he wasn't necessarily even know why he was making these choices, except through his own impulse, and to see how those ended up shaping that life that put him in position, to do these important things. And so on the one hand, they almost look serendipitous, but on the other hand, you say it was preordained, or say whatever you want, but there was an intelligence from going from here to here, to the court instead of to the imperial court instead of to the priesthood, for instance. And I was really taken by what was the events that drove him to make these decisions early in his life. But I think what I learned most about Norbert that I didn't know and that I really respected was a little bit like what Andrew was talking about, is he just he was going to do what he thought was right, and it didn't matter what you said, and it didn't matter what he said, and it didn't matter what I said, and you might not like it, and if you didn't like it, you could stick it. And again, this is what I mean. It's kind of, I feel like it's a sensibility that we kind of get today, but it doesn't feel like it was the sort of thing that was very commonplace at the time. Now, he could do that to some extent because of the nobility. He was of noble birth, and he had the education and the confidence. But still in all, I mean, he made some decisions. I mean, he apparently turned down a bishopric, we think. And, well, who does that? But he had a notion about that. And I just think that I was really taken by this guy in the sense that I really do think that he had a sense that there's something important waiting for me, and I don't know what it is, and I don't know where it is, and I don't know when it is, but I know it's going to happen. And watching him navigate the course of his life, moving toward this destination that he doesn't know what it's going to be, was fascinating. I had a lot of admiration, and I do think he had qualities that we don't necessarily. They weren't all admirable. I do think he. I think he could play both sides. He was definitely a politician, with all the connotations that means. I do think he could be very critical, hurtfully critical. I do have the sense that he matured as he got older, and he ameliorated that sense a little bit. But I just think he was one of those people that he obviously, a lot of his colleagues thought, well, who the heck is he to be telling me? I mean, kind of a know-it-all. And yet he overcomes. There's a collective greatness about his person and his collective qualities that lets him rise above the irritating things that the foibles and things that we all have. And this confidence. Where does this confidence come from? You can't do this. You can't lead this kind of a life unless you have complete confidence in who you are and where you're coming from. And of course, ultimately, and I think after his conversion experience, which we all know was a thing that was sometime in happening. Maybe he was thrown from the horse, maybe not. But there clearly was a conversion experience of several years anyway. Once he had that, then I think he thought he was doing God's will. And we know that when you are confident you're doing God's will, and you're going to do what you're going to do. But he was going to do what he was going to do quite some time before that ever happened. And I don't know. I think there's something appealing about that kind of confidence, even when it's not necessarily warranted. But so I don't know if I've answered your question, but those are just some of the visceral kind of reactions I had. I really liked him. Even if he never founded the order, even if we weren't here because of what happened 900 years ago, I think this is somebody that I would have really wanted to know and would have liked to have spent time with if I'd had the opportunity, because I think he was a really good company, knew everybody, knew what was what, and would be able to tell you a thing or two that would stand you in good stead.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Not so much a question, maybe just kind of a commentary. I appreciated your remarks about the challenge of seeing him in his Sitzum Leben, so to speak, of his time period, but also seeing him as a very modern man, particularly, as you wrap it around into like his entrepreneurial spirit. And how, entrepreneurials today, they really need good administrators and managers behind them. They have a vision, but they're not always, perhaps in their own determination and arrogance, difficult to work below.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also this element of how history repeats itself. And, this issue of lay investiture, for example, I've been seeing that now in the lens of what's going on with the church in China, and who is appointing the leaders of the church. I don't know if that's occurred to you, or if there are any comments you'd like to say. But,
that hadn't. It's a really interesting point. But I guess I would just say that, even though I did say earlier that it's important that I think you keep historical figures in the context of their times. It's also true what Shakespeare said, there's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
Really. And I think that a lot of the issues that Norbert was dealing with, whether it was establishing the order or whether it was, being a diplomat, we see, playing out every day, and the tensions between the powers of the state and the powers of religion, and the tension in people's lives between in their faith and their adherence to religious practices and religious organizations, and the tensions that exist with the secular powers. It's funny you mentioned Hugh. Can you? I think Hugh probably spent a ton of time kind of going behind Norbert and cleaning up. Don't you think?
Yeah. I think he worked really hard.
I think he worked really hard too, and I think, but the difference is, the world is full of entrepreneurs that start these companies, but they're not God's gift of management. And, I think you all know. I mean, there's a huge difference between effective leadership and effective management. People use them as like they're synonyms. Not at all. I mean, a good manager can be a good leader, and a good leader, some good leaders are capable of management. But, Steve Jobs, was not the guy you wanted to run the daily operations. And so some of these guys and women who start these companies end up having to be thrown out because, the stuff that needs to get done doesn't get done because the visionary thinks he or she is good at everything. And I think one of the reasons that I really respect Norbert is I think he realized early on, I'm the idea guy in this, but I don't want to be the one that's policing what's happening in the refectory and stuff like that. I can get people for that. And I think he realized right away with Hugh, he had somebody that was, I think they made a great team. And, but a lot of people, a lot of the visionaries never can make that leap. They don't. They have too much arrogance or too much pride, or they're too blinded to see that they may be brilliant, but they can't manage their way out of the sack. One of the other things, it's not just Hugh. Almost all the really critical early people that Norbert recruited went on to become, bishops and abbots. A number of them have been canonized. Some of the very, probably within the first 100 people that Norbert recruited to the order were among the most significant people in the history of the order, and were great leaders and managers. So one of the other qualities I think he's just really good at finding good people, and then being smart enough to know what to do with them. And I think that's something that would have been just as difficult 900 years ago as it is today. You were going to ask another question.
Well, just in continuing your remarks on Hugh, I feel like he's always been kind of, let's say, not given the significance or importance that he must have played. Even within the eyes of the church, he was only blessed, not canonized. But I'm thinking you seem to have a grasp of him. Would this be a sequel for you to consider?
What did I ever do to you? I think he's a great story. I have to tell you, maybe Father Ted knows, I don't know. I certainly came across a lot of material about Hugh in my research, but I don't know whether I don't think it's nearly as rich as what we have as we do with Norbert. And so even though Norbert is almost a millennium old, we know a lot about him. But that's really unusual to know that much about somebody that lived so long ago. And with Hugh, I think it would be much more opaque. And part of that is because I think Hugh wanted it that way. I think it's pretty clear from the start that he latched on to Norbert. He appreciated what a special person Norbert was. But he was very happy to have that I don't want to say ancillary role, but that the enabling role. People can't be great without people surrounding them who make it possible for them to be great. And they did great. They may do great things themselves, and I completely agree with Andrew that I think in a sense it was Hugh that was really the true founder of the order, in that he carried out Norbert's vision. But to some extent, I think as St. Paul was to Christ, in terms of the arising of Christianity, Hugh was to Norbert in terms of the development and evolution and guaranteeing the longevity, because it was Hugh that put a plan into place. So he probably would be a very good book, but I'll be happy to let somebody else write that one. Yes, sir.
Andrew was talking about the contrast between what we learned as novices and what we discovered as we've gotten older. And one of the things that I learned that I found rather striking and even jarring, a number of Norbert's early followers died because of the austerity.
Right.
And you mentioned about how he grew in different ways. Could you talk about growth in that regard of a commitment to an austere life, so first things first and get rid of the distractions, but to the extent that it literally could kill people?
Right.
Versus a man who would work for reconciliation. Well, part of reconciliation is a person being reconciled with what they're capable of versus what he's capable of.
Yeah, great question. I'll take a stab at it, and then I'll invite Andrew to chime in. Norbert was, we sometimes talk about true believers, and it's especially common whenever we're talking about someone who's a convert to anything, that they tend to have this, they've seen the light, and so they have a zealotry about them, and they can't understand why. I can see it so clearly, but you can't see it, or you're not picking up on it, or whatever. And I think in those early years, especially, Norbert, the true believer, he was pulling, in his zealotry, he was pulling these people around him, and he was very good at it. I mean, he clearly was a magnetic, incredibly charismatic. That's one I should really reinforce. I think he was an incredibly charismatic person. Another reason I think that's a modern kind of sensibility or characteristic that at least that we think about. But then he just expected them to share that zealotry or whatever. And I think the other thing about Norbert, he must have been a physical phenomenon. I mean, I think we have a sense from the history that he was probably a little bigger than most men of the time, and he certainly had robust health generally. But if you think about it, he probably traversed more mileage in Europe in his time than maybe literally any other person of the age. And most of it was on foot or maybe on a donkey on a good day. Mm-hmm. How many miles did you guys figure that you
remember one of the students said it was several thousand.
Oh, it's like maybe 17,000 miles.
Yeah.
I mean, and I mean, we're talking about over the Alps. And so in other words, and so to your question about some of his early adherents dying, I just don't think stuff like that would have crossed his mind in the beginning because he was so eaten up with the Spirit, and because he apparently needed less nourishment, or he had more energy or whatever. But then I think when these tragedies did happen, it definitely we know it affected him. I mean, he was terribly sad and guilty and depressed about some of these early colleagues dying on him, because in large part probably because of what he imposed on them. And I think he took that to heart. I think we see it again when he founds Prémontré, because in the beginning it's like the strictest of the strict kind of rules to live by. And but what is it? I think one of the brothers of St. Martin's, when he was trying to, when he was proposing that they impose this really strict regimen there, it's like God wants us to humble ourselves, but not or mortify ourselves, but not kill ourselves. I think Norbert starts getting it. So at Prémontré, he started, and again, I can't imagine Hugh wasn't right here in the middle of this going, you're killing us. You're literally killing some of us. We gotta, how about we maybe, change things around a little bit, or we temporize some of this. I think he learned all the time. And again, I think that's one of the reasons I really admired him, because he'd make mistakes, including maybe asking too much or inhuman things of his followers sometimes, and then he realized, surely that's not what God wants of us. And so why don't we think better of that? And he had no problem changing. He was changing all the time. And so I think it was easier for him to change what he expected of others too.
Yeah, I think that Norbert was an enthusiast, that he often made, decisions right on the moment, but that he was always willing to go back. And so, for example, on being ordained priest and deacon on the same day, when he goes to Fritzlar, he's going there basically to be absolved from having done that. Or at Prémontré, when he picks the more rigorous form of the rule of Augustine, but then backs off of it. So it's this, doing things quite spontaneously, but not as we might see in some situations, where this is the decision I made and I'm sticking to it, whether it's right or wrong. That he could back off and say, "Oh, all right, I can see, maybe I've made a mistake here," and that it wasn't like that it went up. That he was doing that throughout his life. That sort of thing happened.
And on that point, don't forget the only reason we know so much about Norbert's life mostly comes from B to A and B to B, and the only reason all that stuff is in there is he told them. And so the reason that we think he may have been a borderline libertine or whatever in his earlier days is because he was talking about this with them, and he was making the case, don't do what I did. I did this, and that was really bad. I made a mistake, but but with God's help, I got over. He was using. He was using it, to teach. But I think it was also an example of how he had no problem whatsoever admitting that he may have had firm opinions, but sometimes he was wrong. The question is, are you going to learn from the mistakes you made? And I think he did. I think the rest of his life, I think he was willing to admit that he didn't always get it right.
John, you have
Tom, first of all, thanks for being here. Two things. One, I appreciated the detail that I got out of in your book, where after his conversion, Norbert goes back to Xanten and really faces a lot of criticism and flat out,
Rejection.
called hypocrite,
Yeah.
and to the point where somebody spits in his face.
Right.
And then you talk about how that affected him. That was really human for me to recognize that, number one, and to connect that to reading the Vita A, in chapter 10 of the Vita A, where Norbert performs the exorcism on the 12-year-old girl. I find that to be the most fascinating chapter of Vita A. I teach my students the Vita A and the Vita B, but I always focus on that chapter because I have a little bit of fun with it, because to me, I never realized until I read the Vita A and the Vita B how many encounters with the devil and he and the confreres faced. And I show my kids film clips from The Exorcist because I think the parallels between chapter 10 and The Exorcist are amazing. In your research to do this book, was there anything that you found about that aspect of St. Norbert, like the human response that he had to the negativity that he faced? Was there anything that you found in relation to dealing with evil that he either felt or experienced, and how that might have affected him?
Well, his humanity, I think, is one of the things, just in general, I think is something that I really, that resonated with me from the start. And not just because he did great things and isn't that impressive, but precisely because of things that happened when he goes in there, he has his conversion experience, and they ask him to go in and clean up this chapter, and they're going, well, who are you to tell us? I mean, you were just out 6 months ago, we were out running around together, and you're just a hypocrite, and literally spitting in his face. And I think you can feel the shame or mortification or the questioning, wondering, well, is this what it's all? Is this what God was directing me to do? That can't be. But the questioning, and he would end up going for 3 years trying to figure out, what God's plan for him was. And so I think that sense of humanity, including not, knowing you're not measuring up, or you're maybe even just flat out failing, but not letting it stop you, it just makes you keep going. That was very interesting. The whole thing about the devil and evil and the exorcisms is so interesting to me, because I don't have to tell you, but in the Middle Ages, in his world, this was as real as the sun coming up. The fact that the devil existed, and there were possessions and bad. If you were afflicted, it was just as likely to be the devil working on you as some disease. And that sense, again, that confidence, and again, knowing that he was working in God's interest, so he felt, to take it just head on. And I think one of the reasons that he was such a magnetic. In no time at all, they had thousands of people, trying to converge on him. And I think one of the big reasons why is the word was out there. He's the real deal. He's out there doing battle with the devil. He's a healer. He talks to God. God talks back. That meant something. And I think that was. And you're right. And for those of you that haven't read it or haven't read it in a long time, this encounter with the exorcism of the 12-year-old girl is one of the most harrowing things I've ever encountered anywhere. And as a writer, as a reporter, it has a ring of truth about it, because how on earth would anyone ever make up the details of that exorcism in which this young woman, who clearly is illiterate, she's 12 years old, but she's reciting the Song of Songs, and then she's reciting it in German, and then she's reciting it in French, and then she's reciting it backwards. Who thinks that up? If somebody was just trying to make up a fanciful story. So, I think it. We look back from our present-day perspective, and we can elect to believe or not believe certain things. But I think in his time, there was no question that he was somebody who was seen as the devil's equal, and that was a great part of his mystique, if you will. Ted, yes.
One of the major things that I find comes out between the dialogue between you and Andrew is Norbert was considered the founder of the order. I think Andrew said it was more your Foster was the founder. But I think there's a word that it's skipped here, inspirer. And Norbert was an inspirer to others. He inspired you, of course. He inspired this one and that one. He got them going.
Yes.
And then he didn't have to stay around. He may have spent 2 years here. You're here, 2 months here, but he inspired others to take the words he was using and take it to others.
Couldn't agree more.
If Norbert was such an inspiration and gathering all these people who recognized God working through him, what happened at the end when he was in Magdeburg, Archbishop, and they tried to kill him at least 3 times? So what was different?
Well,
go ahead.
And that's another case, like getting to Joe's question. Norbert, in this, after his conversion and starts to gather people, one of his issues with peace, talk about a parallel today, people were constantly bringing people to court over property, the disputes over property. And Norbert says, I will never do that. I will never do that. I will never, bring... That's exactly what he does in Magdeburg, because in the previous administration or administrations, a lot of the property of the church had been alienated. And he makes a major effort to have that property repossessed by the church, which again makes these enemies, and now there's assassination attempts on them. So
and some of them were, of course, from the clerics themselves. I mean, I just think you've got somebody who, you know, if somebody who comes in from the outside, you know, these guys feel like they've got a great situation going, including with their wives or, you know, concubines, you know, or whatever, and then he's going to upset the apple cart. It is interesting that it was so violent. And yet the other thing, again, this notion of confidence, I don't think he thought for a minute anyone was actually going to be able to kill him. I don't think he thought for a minute that God would let it happen. That, you know, and again, where does that come from? I don't know. But I don't think you can walk into a situation that fraught and that dangerous and be that firm, you know, without that sense of confidence, whether it was misplaced or not. And I'm sure by then he just felt, you know, after the first couple of efforts, he felt like he had God's protection, and maybe he did. But it's a reminder that this is not namby-pamby stuff. This isn't just sermonizing on Sunday about, you know, values and things like this. This is talking about living your values and living the apostolic message. And if it means putting it all on the line, well, it does mean putting it all on the line. And if that means, you know, it's going to cost you your life, well, then that's what the cost is. Yeah. But again, I just, you know, I think that was how he thought.
Yeah. There's so much that I think that in this period in Magdeburg that he goes back. I mean, that what he's doing, he's drawing on his talents and learnings from before his conversion. So, for example, there's this little piece that Norbert really fought to have from the Pope, that from Magdeburg would be the evangelization of Poland. Now, we never hear about that, right, because he died before he could do it. But I mean, it wasn't like, you know, I'd like to do this. I mean, he was making a case against another diocese. From Magdeburg will be the evangelization of Poland. Well, I mean, he was drawing on, you know, the fact that he could read, that he could write, you know, the clerics, that he was at the court, he had the connections, he had the personality, the force to do that.
And the Norbertines that he brought to Magdeburg did eventually evangelize the Poles.
Because as Tom said, he founds these dioceses, Jericho, Brandenburg, Ratsburg, and he puts in them these people whose feast we celebrate, Isford, Evermote. One of the greatest theologians of this period is Anselm of Havelberg, who he and Norbert are like this. And again, what Anselm is writing about, because the Norbert is being criticized that he's starting a form of religious life that was not traditional. And Anselm makes this great case. This is what the Holy Spirit does. The Holy Spirit creates new things, and that this is, you know, that the Spirit is working in Norbert to do this. And Anselm is also coming back to the thing that Norbert is a great peacemaker between the powers of the time.
I know we're going into overtime, so we should maybe wrap up. But I did want to say on that point, the flip side of Richard's question earlier. One of the things that frustrated me as writing this is knowing that we'll never know some important answers or answers to some important questions about Norbert's life. And one of them, for instance, was what was the real deal about how he ended up going to Magdeburg in the first place? I mean, there was this all sort of hard to believe sort of coincidences that put him in this place, fired. And I think, and then we don't know, and we never will know for sure. And Grauan, who I should have said, please be aware that the scholarship from your confrere apostle, Wilfred Grauan, is astonishing. And if you don't read German, the book that Andrew references in German, but there's an English translation at the Center for Norbertine studies, which is, it's just remarkable. But to see a world-class historian and work on your guy was fascinating. But we don't know for sure. But I think maybe one of the reasons that he wanted maybe to go to Magdeburg was because he knew that it would put him in the circle of the emperor, and that would, among other things, allow him to expand the order much further to the east, which he did, and to protect the order. So while he and the others were trying to get this fledgling operation, on its legs, but when it was still in a vulnerable stage, if he was the counselor to the emperor, maybe the best thing that he could do for the future of the order was to be there, have it completely under the emperor's protectorate. So, but I don't know that. And
the other piece in that, and again, there is really so much scholarship that we're not aware of, even in English. Carol Neal has a very interesting article that she did on the apocalyptic sense at that time. And you know how, like, the Orthodox Jews, the Messiah won't come until all of Israel is, back, and all those predictions. One of the reasons that Norbert may have actually, wrangled is because he felt, the end time is coming, and all of these people east of the Elbe are still pagans. And that's why he starts these dioceses. These are missionary dioceses. Anselm never really gets to be in Havelberg because there's this battle with the Wends over evangelization. So again, there are all these little pieces that, we talked today about intersectionality. So the emperor, apocalypticism, that kind of stuff, all coming together.
And that's back to Ted's point earlier, which I think is very spot on. Whatever else he was the inspiration. And just one small indication of what an inspiration he was that the organization that they started 900 years ago is still here, still functioning all over the world, and people are still being drawn to its charisms and its missions. And that doesn't happen unless there is truth and authenticity and of course righteousness, I think, with the inspiration. And I think he knew that that's what he was good at, and he just kept inspiring and inspiring and inspiring and inspiring his entire life.
So I think we'll at least as far as the live streaming, bring this to a close. I would think I would hope that maybe all of us have some new thoughts about Norbert and how that might impact us individually, as a community. Tom, thank you very much for that major contribution you've made in the book and for being with us today.
Thank you.